Hi folks, now we're talking about Chapter 9, Social Class and Social Inequality. And this can be a sort of loaded chapter in terms of how we think about what a social class is. When folks think about a concept like social class, outside of sociology, people often think of it in more folksy, more colloquial terms. They'll think about people who are perhaps balling or maybe called ballers. They'll think about dukes and duchesses and queens and kings and royalty. Those are some ways within which we could look at distinct social classes and experiences with social class. However, when we look at it sociologically, there's more nuance. So we first have to define what a social class is. Now, for sociologists, a social class is a large group of people in a society that have similar rankings in terms of wealth and power and prestige. In terms of wealth, we're talking about the assets that they hold, what they own minus what they owe. Power, we're looking at the ability that they have to exercise control within society, either individually and particularly in terms of the impact that they have over others. And in terms of prestige, we're talking about, well, what respect could you give that individual based upon their position in society? And those, again, ranked higher on all of those dimensions are thought typically to be of a higher social class. But if we again think about it in terms of that close ranking within a class, if we look at the middle class folks, from one middle class person to another, we will typically see very similar amounts of power that they have in terms of their occupations and their authority on those jobs. And within society too, from one middle class person to another, you'll see similar amounts of respect given to them based upon the kind of work that they do. And they will have similar amounts of assets or wealth that they've attained over their lifetime and over their careers and so forth. So, and again, each class has that sort of tight clustering, if you will, that range of similar rankings on wealth and power and prestige. So, typically within sociology and for sociologists, we distinguish a few different levels and types of social classes. And so for sociologists, we're talking about the upper class at the top, the middle class, the working class, and then the poor or the lower class. Right? Now, for the upper class, starting there, the upper class refers to the top 5% of U.S. Households. The top 5% of U.S. households in terms of income and wealth could be referred to or thought of as fitting an upper class label or status. Generally, we're looking at household earnings that at the floor, at that beginning amount, they typically start at more than 3 times what the average household makes. Now, the average household in this country makes about $61,000 per year, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. So they're the government agency that collects data for a variety of reasons and purposes on the U.S. population. And so what they've determined using data from last year, that's the most recent year that they have the data that are collected, that the average household, so regardless of whether we're talking about people who are related or not, the average household in this country from one household to another earns about $61,000 a year. So that's the median household income right smack dab in the middle of the income distribution. So half of the households in the country make more and half of the households in the country make less. So going back to the upper class, often we think of them as the wealthy, for short, as a sort of shorthand. The upper class, you're looking at households that make from the, at minimum, mid $180,000 a year mark. So from 185 on up is where you would start to see it phased in upper class status. And again, that will vary by location. If you're making 180 or more in Michigan, it's very easy to fit more into an upper class lifestyle. If we're looking at Washington, D.C. or San Francisco or Manhattan in New York, it's going to take you a lot more money to be considered upper class because those parts of the country have a higher standard of living. Now, one thing to keep in mind about the upper class is that, as a general rule, their money tends to not come from working as much. And so that might sound kind of strange. It's a bit of a paradox in that often with upper class people, what really makes them upper class and distinctly fitting an upper class status is the fact that their money works for them, whereas the other classes tend to work for their money. So think about it, upper class folks, the wealthy, aren't necessarily wage earning to earn the income that they have. A lot of their income comes in the form of inheritance that's invested, other forms of investment like stocks and bonds and real estate, insurance, owning lots of different kinds of property and land holdings, all of those kinds of things that are not necessarily tied to a 40-hour work week. So that's how the wealthy or the upper class tend to make their money, having a lot of wealth and assets that produce or spin off various amounts of income that they can live on. So keep in mind that when the upper class or the wealthy work, it's typically a choice, it's not a necessity. So within the upper class, you have layers as well. So at the very top of the upper class, the top 1% of U.S. households, you're looking at the upper uppers, what we often refer to as the old money. So this is generational wealth, it's dynastic wealth. And so this amount of money for these households has been invested, and passed down over generations, sometimes even more than a century. So in if we want to think about this as Michiganders and Michiganians, good examples of that kind of top 1% wealth would be, for instance, the Ford family, or if we thought of the Dow of Dow DuPont, if we think of that chemical company and the ties that they have here. So the families that started those two Michigan-based companies are good examples, if you will, of the older 1% kind of money. So the old saying is that the best way to be or become old money is to be born that way. So you're typically born into that kind of wealth to become old money, right? And so old money, the older elite families don't necessarily work because, again, they have the investments and they have the ability to live off of trust funds, among other kinds of inherited wealth and investments. So overwhelmingly, when the old money works, it is decidedly a choice that they are making to work. They do not have to work. So again, that's a very small percentage of U.S. households and a small percentage of the wealthy within our society. Also, we can't leave out the lower uppers, sort of the newer money, if you will, the working rich. And so the lower uppers, they've typically come into the money during their lifetimes. It wasn't something that was given to them. They weren't granted the money from a family member or some kind of a large endowment. They had to develop the money on their own. So if you think of most of the athletes, entertainers, sports stars, actors, actresses, and the like, overwhelmingly, these are new money folks. And so they often even make far more money. They can make far more money and often do make far more money than the old money, but it's a matter of how the money was made that becomes the issue. It's the fact that the money was made more recently, that they had to work for it, wherein simply because they had to work for it and it's more recent, that it's often not as respected, it's not seen as respected in the way that the old money is. It's not that the new money is not respected at all. It doesn't carry or have the same esteem as a lot of the old money elite families tend to have. So again, most of the famous people that we know are good examples, are exemplary, if you will, of the newer money. So the newer money may at some point get the respect of the older money, particularly if you're looking at the offspring or the descendants, if you will, of the newer money. So that's sort of how that works. Regardless of whether we're talking about old money or new money, overwhelmingly, here are some characteristics, additional ones, that sort of describe and distinguish the wealthy. And so the upper class, the wealthy, are often known for their privacy, the ability to be secluded and privatized away from the vast majority of the population. Private streets, private neighborhoods. They may live in very, very unique kinds of environments where most people don't really have much exposure to. So they may have vast land holdings that surround the property or properties that they own and live on, for instance. They have exclusive addresses wherein there are layers of social distance between them and others. So they may live in a building where there's door services, concierge services where someone can run packages up to them, go shopping for them. They may have personal shoppers. So that privacy that they have and the ability to secure social distance through purchasing services that are more expensive than the average person can afford, those are good examples of what makes life very distinct and different for people who are upper class. So that exclusivity is certainly something that happens. When they work, they typically are senior executives, senior management, chief executive officers in large corporations, or they run their own. They run rather their own companies and small businesses, and so they tend to be much more entrepreneurial, and they tend to be leaders of international companies, corporations, and the like. Overwhelmingly, they're in charge of people who are below them in status and class. And so, if you're upper class or wealthy and you're working, you're much more likely supervising somebody who is upper middle class, or if they are wealthy, they have less wealth. Often, consequently, they are new money. Right. All right. So that's one way of looking at the upper class or the wealthy. Again, that's the top 5% of the U.S. population. Now, the largest class overall, typically consisting of at least 40% of the U.S. population, we refer to, if you will, as the middle class. And so often that's why people think of the United States as a middle class society, in that you have it encompassing the largest concentration of people, citizens within the country. And so if we think of income ranges rather for the middle class, we're typically looking at incomes from, on the low end at the very beginning, $45,000 for a household, all the way up to just under $185,000. So again, that's a very, very wide range. And so we're looking at sort of the, if you will, entry point, just below the entry point for the wealthy, at the mid 180s all the way down to the mid 40s. And so it's a wide range of incomes, a wide range of educations, and a wide range of occupations. Among the things that make middle class people middle class and make that lifestyle distinct include the following, one of which is marriage. And so the ability to marry and be married and to stay married, that typically does create and solidify and produce middle class income, because you're looking typically at two spouses coming together who are both working and in the labor force. In addition to that, we're also looking at higher education. And so having gone to college for at least 2 years, and often having gone for significant amounts of study at college, those often allow for middle class people to secure a lifestyle that is going to be sufficient to support them and to support a family. At the top of the middle class, we have the upper middles, kind of like what we saw with the wealthy or the upper class. And so the upper middle class, you're typically looking here at household incomes of six figures or more, if you will. And also, I should say, too, the household notion that I talk about, when we're looking at government data, typically they're looking at a four-person household as the standard sort of distinguished kind of household. So that's sort of seen as the average, the four-person household. And so when we're talking about a household, we're really looking at four people, typically two partners, two parents, and then their dependent kids. So obviously, if we're looking at a household that's one or two people, that's going to be different in terms of where people fit in social class. So, but yes, so if we're looking at the middle class, the upper middle class, those folks at the top, those households of four or more people on average, we're typically looking at the most educated members of the middle class across the country. So we're looking at folks who have graduate or professional degrees, they have law degrees, they have very distinct training in unique higher ed fields, for instance. And so folks who've gone into nursing, medicine, dental hygiene, those are examples of folks who can easily get to an upper middle class lifestyle in one way, shape, or form. And so they have that specialized education and training, and they also, of course, make incomes that are consistent with that and that allow them to more likely pair up with someone else as a partner or a spouse who has a similar amount of education, earnings, and experience. And so for a lot of the upper class, as the most educated members of the middle class, the upper middle class, I should say, as the most educated members of the middle class, they can and often do own their own homes. They have invested assets, and they earn significant amounts over time, and they can also skirt the edges and blur the lines, if you will, of what upper class actually is. Again, depending on how much they work. But again, the upper middle class will, even if they're making good money, they will be working a lot more in a lot of respects over time than someone who is upper class. As in the case of an upper class person, someone who's upper middle class, they're often in a supervisory capacity where they are in charge of, at work, folks who are in lower status positions or in lower class positions technically. So you can see that often on campuses, on colleges and universities, a lot of the upper administrators, they are in charge of folks who are at lower levels, albeit still within middle class standing in the vast majority of cases. That brings us to the average members of the middle class, and so these are less educated members of the middle class. Typically, they're making household incomes of significantly under $100,000 a year for a household of 4 people, and again, it's still going to be more than the minimum figure to be considered middle class of about $45,000. So here we're looking at typically positions that are less prestigious, that may be in a number of different fields. So lower paid healthcare positions, lower paid positions in civil service such as police and fire departments. We could also be looking at paramedics and social workers. So these are educated folks, but not to the extent that you see at the top of the middle class. They may or may not own a home. However, that is much more likely in reach for them over their lifetimes in particular. Now, 1/3 of the population below the middle class is the working class. And so here we're looking at household incomes of typically $25,000 plus to just under $45,000 for a household of 4 people on average. So working class folks are often referred to socially or colloquially as the lower middle class. And so in a way, it's sort of the entry point to the middle class on the low end. You're much more likely, if you are working class, to be working hourly and not earning a salary. And because of that, if you miss work, you miss pay. You don't see that as much with middle class folks who are average middle class status or higher. Those folks typically are exempt workers, and so they're getting a salary that pay them extensive benefits. So for working class folks, they may get a significant wage, but it's going to be lower than the average middles, and it's typically going to be subject to them working hourly and not on a salary basis. They also may wear a uniform to work. That is to say that they are much more likely to be blue collar as opposed to white collar, where they could wear, if you will, what we often think of as standard office attire. Working class families are much more vulnerable to financial problems, often based upon unemployment and illness. And so if we think about what's happened during COVID-19, if we look at workers who are deemed essential workers, they're deemed essential workers, but they're making a lower wage. That makes them more vulnerable, especially if they are working during the pandemic conditions. And so it's that paradox of, well, we need you, but we are not paying you in a way that shows how much we need you and how much your work is appreciated within society. And there's been some efforts to make that better. Obviously, we've seen that with increased unemployment benefits for the past few months, but also there's still tension about whether those kinds of benefits should increase for the workers who've been laid off and let go. And again, you're much more likely, if you are working class, to be beset with the problem of being unemployed or often underemployed, and we have talked about that as well. If you're working class, you're much less likely to graduate from college. You may have attended college, but you're much more likely to have dropped out and not finished with a degree. And that is something that we have seen significantly happen over the past several years in particular. The remaining 20% of the population is poor. Those households that are 4 people, typically 4-person households, wherein you're looking at household incomes of $25,000 or less. And overwhelmingly, we're looking at a strong geographic separation and segregation of the poor from members of other classes. And so if we're looking at all the classes, the poor are the most relegated away from amenities and from members of other classes in terms of where housing and other kinds of residential opportunities tend to be for the poor. Even when the poor work, and a significant portion, more than 1/3, do work, when it comes down to working, often the wages that they earn keep them at the secondary level of the labor market. We had talked about that before. The secondary labor market includes those jobs where you are making typically subsistence level wages, not enough to support a family. And so that is often what really keeps and conspires people to be impoverished, is the fact that they are making a low wage.